we're going to continue with the dominant accessibility. We're going to talk about writing HTML that helps screen readers and other technologies interpret the types of things that we're building. So we typically call this semantic HTML. And you might ask the questions like, why can't I just shove everything in a div? If you do this, you'll see a web page that probably looks okay. Well, the div content, it's short for divider. It's kind of meaningless in the types of things that you might put in it. It's the most generic container for just about anything. But HTML provides a lot of default elements that describe the purpose and intent behind the content that they contain. So H1 through H6, right, are headings that you can treat like an outline, where H1 is the top of that outline, and H6 is, a very inner nested level of an outline. And you might imagine, right, that if you're using these elements, that you should use them in the proper order, such that you treat, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 in a proper descending order. There are tags like A for anchors that mean that this is a link that navigates the user somewhere. There are, of course, once we introduce JavaScript, other ways to cause page navigations. But if we start with the link and augment things with JavaScript, as we talked about with progressive enhancement, what we get are functions that work by default with a screen reader. Of course, buttons trigger any kind of operation. This could be opening and closing modals. This could be expanding and collapsing menus. But by using a button as the HTML element, the screen reader knows how to interpret that. And finally, properly using things like tables, images, paragraph tags, the form element. These things all have typical meanings, right, that put our content in not just a visual form, but with some description that screen readers can pick up on. Of course, we're going to talk about this a little bit, but it's really not just screen readers, but search engines, bots, other APIs that rely on pulling out this semantic information for parsing our web page. So, we could also make the case that using proper HTML helps websites like Google index your web pages. And of course, if you're building a website, you probably want it to show up in Google results. So all of these things can be helpful. More recent changes, and by more recent, I don't necessarily mean in the last year, but in the last few years have brought a lot of really useful elements to HTML. And so what you sometimes want to think about is like finding the most appropriate element for the task. And it turns out there's a lot of HTML elements that you might never encounter. And so sometimes it's worth skimming the HTML spec. I do mean skim or doing a command F, because unsurprisingly, the entirety of the HTML spec is, quite a few chapters. It even takes some time to load on school Wi-Fi. But literally, if you have a question about what can HTML do, it is answered in the most detailed level. And I think one of the skills about being not just a programmer who, throws code in a text editor, but actually being a disciplined software engineer is knowing that things like specifications exist and taking the time to dive into them when necessary, because they are, so to speak, the source of truth about how something works. So I'll just offer a few highlights. HTML includes new interactive elements like details and dialogue, which allow you to expand and collapse content natively or to hide and show certain regions that provide built-in functionalities for working with assistive technology. There are also tags like main, section, article, or nav, which give the browser specific meaning about the purpose of that content. So the main element is really meant to be just what is that main section of the page and why is this useful? It's because a lot of pages, right, have things like headers and footers, which are also elements that by separating those out, help us understand that this is the content that you should focus on. If you're working in an application like, perhaps a news page or a blog, article sort of denotes, a standard segmented piece of information. Navigation is perhaps unsurprisingly for things like navigation bars. And there's all sorts of other useful elements like dates and times get a dedicated time element. Of course, you could just type the text, but using the time element tells the computer that this thing is a specific timestamp and can be parsed in a particular way. If you provide information like progress bars or citations or meters, which are just sort of a variant of a progress bar, HTML provides elements that, you're not going to use them in every situation, but have semantic information behind the intent and purpose of them. So the goal here, right, do not memorize the exhaustive list of HTML elements, but be aware that there are tools that exist that help provide additional information. And of course, there are dozens of HTML elements. And so you'll hopefully expose yourself to them over time. Now, elements, I would say, are only half the story. Behind every element is a set of attributes that provide additional contextual information. So if an element is purely text, it's pretty clear, right, that text content is what is inside the element. But when it comes to things like images, iconography, other sorts of buttons, we might need to augment their description with some additional attributes. So we've seen, right, CSS, the class and ID attributes exist on an element, but there's an entire specification called ARIA, or Accessible Rich Internet Applications, which provides its own set of HTML attributes that allow us to provide descriptive behavior. So on an image, we can use the alt attribute, which is sort of built into HTML, but this says, given something visual, here's a text description. And of course, if you're entirely relying on a screen reader, it's important that when a user encounters an image, they have a way of understanding the meaning. But similarly for search engines, that helps explain the content. On any other element, ARIA provides things like role and label, where label is just a generic text description. So if something has a purely visual representation, you can provide label equals and a description. Or there's things like roles, which, again, don't memorize the set of roles that exist, but you can provide a role such as something like a tab group or a navigation menu or some kind of interactive widget that will tell the screen reader that, hey, this type of input on our website is a standard user interface control, which will perhaps give the user more information, but also let them know how they should interact with the content. The main thing that I'd say is that if you're working with things that normally have text content, you're probably good. If you're working with something visual, you need to make sure that it has a label which makes sense. And later when we talk about some of the interactions, I'll go through an example where I've added a label to a control that otherwise might not be so obvious. But there's a whole host of them. The spec is pretty detailed. It provides a lot of great links. And again, knowing when to jump into a spec is a useful skill. So there's another kind of label that exists in HTML. And of course, that is a label element which you've hopefully used in your various assignments. And this is particularly important because form controls need labels for them to have meaning. If you just arrive at a text box, which is unlabeled, which you will unfortunately encounter on many sites, you might ask the question, what the heck goes in that text box? And if you can see the web page, you might be able to glean that context from something else around the element. But HTML really requires us that we provide some actual label tag, which is linked to our form input. So when we build a form in Rails, there's of course many ways to do this, right? But Rails gives us a bunch of helpers, whether that's label tag and form tag that you use in CHIPS 5.3, or the form helpers that apply the model attributes correctly. But essentially in Rails, if I give a label tag with some input like ratings G, and I have an input tag or a checkbox tag, which creates a checkbox input, the same ratings G, Rails will do the work to link these things up automatically. And what it will generate is HTML, where our checkbox will have a proper input, and our label tag will use this attribute called for, which will link it in our HTML markup to that particular input element. And the really nice thing here is that if you follow the standard patterns, you don't have to think about this most of the time. As long as there's a label there, as long as you're using forms in the standard way, you get proper markup for free. And so that is one of the benefits of using the Rails helpers. And essentially the goal of what Rails is going to do is provide that mapping for you such that if you put your values in the right spots, these labels will be automatically linked up. The other thing that is really useful for interacting with labels on forms is that notice that I can click a checkbox right here. That checkbox might be a little bit small. What labels do is a properly built form will allow a label to trigger selecting that input element. So I can click on PG-13 or the checkbox to trigger the changing state of that checkbox in a basic form like this, where I can click on the word title to interact with and drop my cursor in the input element for the title field of making a movie. And this is one of those things where it might not be super important in every situation if you've got, really nicely laid out form. But in a lot of cases, being able to click on a label makes the website a lot easier to use, and users will do it without ever realizing. If you've ever had a hard time checking a checkbox, for agree to terms and conditions, you can hopefully click that text that says agree to terms and conditions. And if it's a properly built form, that will just work automatically. And so one of the nice things is by following default HTML, you get the benefits of easier to use interfaces. Of course, we're talking about JavaScript, and one of the useful things is that JavaScript provides a way of enhancing these pages in a much more dynamic way. So when I demo the screen reader of seeing a menu expand and collapse, this uses an attribute like aria expanded, which can either be true or false, to tell the screen reader whether something is visible. And of course, as our web page content changes, we would hope that those attributes change and get updated over time. So using a framework like Bootstrap, I didn't have to build anything specific. Just by using proper markup, including their CSS and JavaScript on my page, I get all that for free, which is really useful. But conceptually, if you need to do this, or if you're building something custom, the types of JavaScript that you might write are not terribly complicated, but something that you need to be aware of. So, in jQuery land, right, I might register a click handler on some element. And when I click that element, I might do something like, say, show the thing to the user. And if you stop there, you might realize, or you might assume that, all right, I see the menu, this thing is good. I could call show, I could call hide, I could call slide up or slide down, whatever is most appropriate. But what we also probably need to consider is that as we build dynamic web pages, there's other information that we need to convey in our HTML. So I might then say, in jQuery, I can call the adder method to set an attribute like aria expanded to true. And you might imagine, right, that I have a similar function called hide menu that visually hides the menu and then sets the aria expanded attribute back to false. What are the right attributes that you need to know? We'll come back to that in a minute. But the main thing here is that JavaScript is not just a way of, adding functionality that only some people can use. It actually helps us really enhance the quality and usability of our web pages in many different situations. If I go back to our Raw Potatoes homepage, if you're on Safari or Chrome, you can usually enter a view that puts the web page in sort of a responsive mode or simulates a small screen. This is useful here because what I want to show, if I open the inspector, actually let me do that, is let me dock this on the side and make this a little bigger over here. So I can right click and inspect this element. And notice here that this thing is a button. It has quite a few helpful attributes here. One of them is, in fact, aria expanded false. The other is an aria label that says toggle navigation. Of course, we could change this if we need to, but I got this text for free, essentially, by following the Bootstrap documentation. And in the case of this navigation bar, actually asking ChatGPT to just generate a Bootstrap navigation menu because the format is pretty standard. But the main thing is that, when you follow best practices, you hopefully don't have to think about these things too much. As I click expand or click on the button, we'll notice now that this aria expanded equals true is there. So now it's telling the screen reader that the thing that I just clicked on changed the state of some element such that this menu should be visible. And similar to HTML forms, Bootstrap relies on attributes like custom ones in this case, but data BS toggle is the ID of another element that this button will actually toggle the visibility of. And so the main thing to think about is when you're building an application is using IDs and classes in a sensible way, using attributes to change and enhance the state is something that provides a lot of functionality. And the nice thing again is if you just follow the Bootstrap documentation, in this case, you actually get quite a lot for free without having to know the specific ins and outs of what you might build. But it's kind of neat because you can go in and you can inspect the element there. I'm not going to go through all of it, but if you are working in a browser, you can inspect, and now the page is a little too cramped, but you can actually go in here and you can inspect all of the accessibility properties that a browser is applying to an element. And so if you need to dig into some reason, how is the browser interpreting these things? The web inspector provides all of that information. But, try a web page out, inspect an element, change its state, and you should hopefully see that data changing.